In Your Shoes is a monthly event where we step in your shoes and help you expand and scale your business. And in this particular episode, what we're going to talk about is the risks and opportunities for foreign startups associated with a market entry to China. I hope you're going to enjoy it. Have fun. So who we need to thank at the beginning of this webinar definitely is the Jing'an Creator Space Association. So we're hosting this webinar with them, and thanks so much for all of their well-needed support. We're very grateful for that. Now let me jump right into the topic. Where risks foreign startups face in China and how to mitigate them. And I already see that we have a couple of questions that are arriving here in the Q&A, so feel free to ask all the questions. We're definitely going to cover them, but first let me win some ground here in this presentation, okay? So first thing, here is a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about. So generally, when you talk about risks, we try to come up with a classification that makes some kind of sense, okay? So we said there are time risks and there are monetary risks. What does that mean? Time risks for us is generally when a startup comes over to China and the main thing they lose is their time, okay? So it's not huge money is not at stake, but it's just a bit, they lose some time, and of course time is super valuable, so that's not ideal. Second type of risk are the monetary risk, so that's where, through lawsuits or the wrong form of market entry or other mistakes that you might make, you risk losing a substantial amount of money. And you already see for today I plan to talk about 4 things in more detail. Otherwise it would require more time to get through the whole presentation. So today we're going to talk particularly about, on the time risk side, firstly the choice of the location. What's the right choice of location for you in China? Secondly, startup support partner selection. So what mistakes can you make when you choose the partner for your China market expansion? Thirdly, negotiations with investors. So we're going to take a little deep dive into the venture capital landscape and going to discover what mistakes you can make there and what risks you should be aware of and how to mitigate them. And lastly, protection of your IP. What do you need to know? And how do you go about protecting your intellectual property during the process of market expansion. Okay, let's jump right into it. And I see more questions are arriving here, so feel free to ask more questions. I will answer them in due time. First one. Time risk number 1, the choice of your location. Many, especially foreign startup founders, approach me, and they are extremely confused about where to land in China. China is a very big country, and to some foreign founders, it's not obvious that different cities in China can be as different as in Europe, different countries. Okay, so it makes sense to think about China in terms of a continent more than it makes sense to think about it as a country, because really the difference between Beijing and Shanghai is huge already. But then when you talk about tier 3 cities and tier 1 cities, the difference is just like day and night. So it's very difficult to think about China as one homogeneous country and it doesn't make any difference where you expand. That's wrong. So definitely need to be aware of that. Now, once you know that, as a founder, of course you need to ask yourself, what's the right city for me myself? And now when we look at this map that we have here in front of us, We have Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen that we sketched out. Why is that? Those are tier 1 cities. They are super well economically developed. Everybody knows about them, and for a good reason. So in Beijing we have a lot of VC money and a lot of VC headquarters centered there. But we also have a lot of innovation centers in Beijing. And Beijing still, if you look at the total VC distribution in China, then the area around Beijing pulls the most. Now we have players like Baidu headquartered there, and for many people looking at China, Beijing is one of the prime options to land at as a city. For Shanghai, on the other hand, the number one word that comes to mind when we talk about Shanghai is international. It's just the most international city in China. It has a high amount of expats who live here. It's a tiny little bit better to come around to get along if you don't speak Chinese. But it's also the center of lifestyle, life science, of such big companies such as Ctrip who are based here. So again, looking at the venture capital distribution, the whole area around Shanghai, so also including Nanjing, Hangzhou, etc., is the second largest conglomerate of VC capital. And then the third one, Shenzhen, also a good choice, but mostly for startups that have something to do with hardware. So of course, Shenzhen, we have such players as Foxconn, and so for many hardware startups, Shenzhen is a very, very good choice for expansion. However, it's definitely less international than Shanghai, and it's in terms of significance, maybe cannot yet match a city such as Beijing. And that basically concludes this chapter. So the number one mistake you can make is to come to China and assume that it's all the same. It doesn't really make a difference whether I go to Shenzhen or I go to Beijing or Shanghai. It does make a big difference. And then for each startup, of course, there's a different right solution, but it mostly depends on what vertical are you active in, so which vertical are you active in, and then based upon that, which city best supports your goals. And then secondly, also, let's be honest, it's personal preference, right? So you will have, you will like some cities more than the others, and if this really is supposed to be a long-term project for you, you want to expand here, you want to scale your startup and be successful here, then of course you should also be located in a city where it's worth living in. Okay, next time risk, that's the startup support partner selection. And here we have a great map of a lot of accelerators and incubators that are active in China. And the first thing that strikes our eye is it's a lot, so it's not a small number. We have a very confusing amount of incubators, accelerators, and different players who are somewhere on the venture capital scale, and difficult to categorize. Now, what's special, and what also for me was special when I first came to China, is that a lot of these accelerators, incubators, startup support partners, they are in some way supported by the government. That's not good, that's not bad, it's just something to be aware of, because in some cases it might skew the incentives of some of these players. So it's something to be aware of, and it's something that's very special about the Chinese startup support partner landscape. For example, in Europe or in the US, the focus would be much more on private and commercially driven players. So these players, they need to actually, let's say, iterate, think about what's their value proposition towards startups, because otherwise they are going to go bankrupt, right? If they don't provide the value, they can't sustain themselves in the long term. So that's something to be aware of. So I don't want to go, we don't need to talk about all those different things listed here, different bullet points listed under Shanghai Focus. But the one thing you need to take with you is this point about, private versus government. And what's our advice here? Really, before you come to China, get some educated opinions. So talk to people who have been here, who have lived here. Talk to people who have worked with different accelerators, incubators, VCs, whatsoever, and get their opinions. And then it's not enough. It's not enough really to to research on the web, because on the web everybody can say everything, and it's easy to put up different survey results and whatever. But it's very important to talk to people personally, and if you don't know anyone, then approach someone who might introduce you to the right person. And nowadays we have tools like LinkedIn. They definitely enable us to go a long way in terms of networking. Okay, and so I got more questions here. Again, let me answer them in 5 minutes. So we don't have much longer to go. Let me answer them in 5 minutes. I'll finish 2 more slides, and then we can talk about all the questions that you have. So keep asking. I already have a question on a couple of questions on the VC. I have one question here: which sectors are the least hit in terms of VC? When is the right time to expand to China as a startup? I do not speak Chinese. Does it matter which city to choose? Just came in. So feel free to ask all the questions. Let me answer them in 5 minutes, okay? Next one. Let's talk about the investor landscape quickly. That's the third time risk. Now let me explain. If we look at total VC in China, of course, or in Asia, then of course there was a dip in Q1 and Q2 in 2019. Those figures are a bit outdated, so they're lacking the Q4 numbers, and certainly Q1 2020 numbers will be even more interesting to look at. What's the message here? Of course, that's Asia, so that's not China. But then if you look at the deal activity in Asia, you have this is mainly driven by China. So two Chinese companies, Beike Jiaofang and Didi Chuxing, were among the 5 largest mega rounds. So Asia is strongly driven by China, and China went and Asia went down in terms of VC. And even more so in Q1 2020, because it's a very, let's say, it's still a very young industry, the whole VC industry in China. The dip is pretty significant. Now, what are some things we need to be aware of when we come here and we think, hey, is VC game in China the same as it is in the US or in Europe? No, of course it's not. Firstly, due to this dip that we have experienced in Q1 and Q2, and now with the new conditions that we experienced due to COVID-19, investors are generally super cautious. Okay, so where 1.5 or 2 years ago it was easier to collect money from Chinese investors, now it's even harder. Investors are doing their due diligence. Plus, if you are a foreigner and there is no particular reason why you, being foreign in this country with your startup and attempting to scale, when there's no particular reason why you should be successful or why this should even be a competitive advantage, then it's going to be even harder for you to collect money. Because the first thing an investor is asking themselves, of course, is why you? Why particularly now? And we have seen over the last years where we worked with numerous startups, we have seen a lot of them fail, a lot of them starting out and then being outrun by their Chinese competition, simply because a Chinese founder will always know the Chinese market better than a foreign founder, and that's just a fact. It's something that's difficult to compensate. But if you are, and that's part of our advice already, if you are able to turn you being a foreign startup into a competitive advantage of some sort, maybe because you have some kind of cross-border business or something else, then the chances are still pretty good for you to collect venture capital. Second thing to be aware of that I want to touch upon here, so we're skipping the financial advisors bullet point. Second thing we're quickly going to talk about is the role designations. So many people talk with, for example, investment managers in China. And if you are coming from Europe, you know that an investment manager has quite some power, decision-making power on whether or not to recommend an investment in a particular startup. Now, here in China, there's kind of, in terms of VC role titles, an inflation going on. So you have people who are really have the authority and decision-making power of an analyst or associate, but they are already called investment managers, and that can be sometimes a little bit strenuous when you talk to someone who you think, this person is an investment manager, but then in reality it's just someone who's doing the due diligence and doesn't have any influence on the investment decision process. So, one piece of advice I already gave, think about what's your USP as a foreign founder and flesh that one out in your pitch deck. Then, second piece of advice is make sure the easiest way to get Chinese venture capital, certainly in the current market environment, is to already have some kind of traction. Because that's a very easy proof that you, as someone who's coming from outside, supposedly has no freaking idea about the market, that you have managed to actually start selling something or have started commercial partnerships and cooperations with different partners. So that's a very strong proof of your commercial viability. Okay, and now the very last one, very last point, IP. So, I often talk to founders, and because I'm half German, half Polish, I often talk to German founders. And in Germany we have a lot of fear about our IP being stolen. The truth is, China is not the Wild West, right? So also here you have lots of protection mechanisms that are protecting you against IP theft of different sorts. And today what we're going to zero in is on the trade secrets. So you have different types of IP rights, brands, patents and design, trade secrets, copyrights. So let's focus on the trade secrets. For trade secrets we have a couple of pieces of advice, and here really let me go through each one of these bullet points because I think they are important. If you want, feel free to take a screenshot because this slide contains quite some valuable advice here. Okay, first of all, identify the critical IP that needs to be protected. We work with a couple of deep tech ventures, so they really have something that, for example, a venture from the semiconductor space. So for them, what we do is we identify what's the IP in your company that really should be protected, that needs to be safeguarded. Then some people might object, but we still think it makes sense for these critical cases to keep your R&D activities in your domestic countries where you're coming from. No need to switch it or to bring it over to China yet. Once you grow, of course, you need to have a discussion around that, and in some cases it does make sense to bring R&D over. But as a default, I would say keep it in your own country. Exclusive licensing to a Chinese company, something that can be considered. Minimizing risk for reverse engineering. What's that? Of course, once you get a technology over, you need to make sure that there's no ways to reverse engineer it and basically be subject to IP theft through that route. Identify and store confidential documents both in electronic or paper-based form. Record meetings and communication with external parties for future reference. That might sound a little bit overly ambitious, but it does make sense, especially for cases where you have highly, where you have very critical IP that might be, that might be very valuable, and you're interacting a lot with external parties that you have, met like never or once, and you're not very familiar with them. So always better to be a bit more cautious than in the end to be disappointed. Now, once you establish your base here, it makes sense to give clear guidelines to employees. So people need to know what are the cornerstones, how to behave, what are the rough rules of doing business in China. So that's very important. You might even sign an employment contract with strict confidentiality provisions for new employees. Once you hire your first employees in China, of course, we would always suggest to engage in cooperations with partners who you have known for a long time, who you already trust. So that's where again this element of reaching out to people through common contacts comes into play. So use your networking muscle and try to get personal recommendations from your personal network. And lastly, that's very important, whoever you decide to work with, make sure that they have good and long-standing cooperations with law firms, because in the end you will need legal support of some sort, and there is huge differences between different accelerators, incubators, VCs, in terms of how closely they work together with law firms, and then also what's the quality of those law firms, right? So you have some of them that are just focused on the Chinese market, and ideally you should go for the ones who have, and we're working a lot with startups, helping them come from outside of China into China, and in that function we have worked with around 40 startups last year, from a multitude of countries, some in Europe, some from Asia, some from Australia. To talk to everyone, have a nice day, hit us up, send us a message if there's anything else that we can help you with, and I hope we're going to have a recording of this online very soon. It was a pleasure, sending you all the best wishes from Shanghai. 谢谢，再见。